I never thought I'd meet someone who could teach me a whole language without ever really speaking it. It sounds weird, I know. But that's exactly what happened when I met Marco, my language exchange partner. We were supposed to just swap vocabulary and grammar, right? Instead, I ended up learning way more about him and myself than any textbook could ever teach. So here's the deal. I'm living in Berlin, trying to improve my Spanish. I figured the best way was to find someone who wanted to learn English and could help me with Spanish in return. That's pretty standard. I found Marco on one of those language exchange apps. His bio was simple: 35, from Madrid, loves coffee and long walks. Nothing flashy, just honest. We matched, exchanged a few messages, and agreed to meet at this cozy little cafe in Kreuzberg. It was supposed to be casual, a couple of hours talking, correcting each other's mistakes, maybe some laughs. When I saw him for the first time, I realized this wasn't going to be your average language partner gig. Marco wasn't just handsome in a generic way. There was something about the way he carried himself, a kind of quiet confidence that didn't need to be loud or flashy. He had these deep brown eyes that looked like they were always searching for something, maybe even inside me. And his smile? It was subtle, but it reached those eyes and made me want to look away and stare again at the same time. We sat down, ordered coffee, and started with the usual introductions. My Spanish was rough, and his English was pretty good. At first, it was textbook stuff. How do you say this? What does that mean? But what surprised me was how little we actually needed words after that. Marco had this way of using his hands, his expressions, even the way he leaned in when he corrected me, that made every lesson feel alive. I remember one moment clearly. I was fumbling over a sentence about the weekend when he suddenly reached over and gently touched my arm to guide my hand. It was innocent enough, but the warmth of his skin and the steady pressure of his fingers made my heart race. I wanted to ask him if that was part of the lesson or if he did that with everyone, but the words got stuck, and instead, I just nodded and smiled. From that day, our meetups became something I looked forward to more than I expected. We met in cafes, parks, sometimes even at his tiny apartment filled with books and plants. Every time, the language barrier between us felt like less of a wall and more of a doorway. Somehow, his body language was teaching me things that no grammar rule ever could. The way he'd pause, bite his lip when he was thinking, or brush a stray hair behind his ear. It all spoke volumes. I kept wondering if he felt the same thing I did, because he never really said it out loud. Our conversations were mostly about verbs and vocabulary, but his eyes and gestures were telling a different story, one that I was desperate to understand. And then came the night when everything changed. We'd been meeting for a few weeks, and I thought I had a handle on my Spanish and maybe even on what Marco was trying to say without words. But when he invited me over after one of our sessions, I realized this was no longer just about language exchange. His body said more than words ever could, and I was finally ready to listen. When Marco invited me over that night, I wasn't sure what to expect. We'd always met in public places, so this was a step into new territory, his personal space. I remember standing outside his building, debating whether I should turn around and call it a night or just go in and see what happened. The truth was, I was curious. More than curious, actually. Nervous too, but in a good way. He buzzed me in, and I took the narrow staircase up to his third-floor apartment. It was small but cozy, exactly like I'd imagined from the pictures of plants and books he'd shown me on his phone before. The lighting was soft, the kind that made everything feel warmer, and there was a faint smell of something like cinnamon or vanilla in the air. It wasn't the sterile, minimalistic vibe you'd expect in Berlin. It felt lived in, personal. Marco was standing by the window when I came in. He turned and smiled that quiet, almost shy smile, the one that made me forget how to breathe sometimes. "Gracias por venir," he said softly. "Thank you for coming." I shrugged, trying to sound casual. I wouldn't miss it. He gestured for me to sit on the couch. We had a few drinks, nothing fancy, just some red wine, and started talking about everything but language. Work, music, silly childhood stories. Somehow, even without perfect words, the conversation felt easy, like we were two people who had known each other longer than a few weeks. At one point, I realized I was watching his hands. He was animated when he talked, fingers moving fluidly, like they were telling their own story. When he laughed, a full, open laugh that made his whole body shake, I felt this pull in my chest. It was like he was showing me a side of himself that wasn't just the polished, charming language partner I'd met before. Then the moment came that I hadn't prepared for. Marco reached out and took my hand. Not in a textbook, let's practice vocabulary way, but really held it, fingers intertwined with mine. It was quiet, no big gestures, no dramatic confessions, just a simple touch that said so much. For a second, I froze. My mind was scrambling for the right words, or any words at all. But then I realized I didn't need to say anything. His eyes were locked on mine, searching, maybe hoping. And I felt this warmth, a kind of safety that I hadn't felt in a long time. I squeezed his hand back and whispered, "I've been wanting to do this for a while." He smiled, a little relieved, and leaned closer. Our foreheads touched, and suddenly the apartment felt even smaller, like the whole world had shrunk to just the two of us. It wasn't about the perfect Spanish sentence anymore. It was about connection, something that didn't need translation. After that night, everything between us shifted. The next time we met up for our language exchange, the tension was different. Electric, but comfortable. Our conversations deepened, and so did the way we looked at each other. Sometimes, we'd get lost in a gaze that said more than any grammar lesson. One afternoon, we were sitting in a park, sharing a picnic of bread, cheese, and olives. I was trying to tell him the story of my last trip to Spain, fumbling with the words and getting half of them wrong. He laughed and corrected me gently, but then he paused, tracing circles on my palm with his thumb. "Your Spanish is improving," he said, "but your heart's already fluent." I looked up at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" His smile was soft, almost shy again. "You don't just learn a language with your mind, you learn it with your heart too. And it's clear yours beats a little faster when you're with me." I didn't know if I was blushing or if the sun was just warm on my face. Maybe both. I tried to find the right words, but they escaped me, so I just nodded and squeezed his hand. The whole thing felt like a dance, sometimes awkward, sometimes smooth, always moving forward. Neither of us rushed it, but we both knew where it was heading. One evening, a few weeks later, Marco invited me to a little gathering with some of his friends. I was nervous since I hadn't met many of his people before, but he promised it would be fun. When I arrived, the apartment was buzzing with laughter, music, and the smell of homemade paella. His friends were welcoming, teasing Marco in Spanish, and occasionally shooting me curious glances. I kept up as best as I could, throwing in the few words I'd learned, trying not to embarrass myself. Marco stayed close, occasionally whispering translations or squeezing my hand under the table. At one point, someone asked how long we'd been practicing together. Marco looked at me, then back at the group, and just said, "Long enough to know this is more than just language exchange." I felt heat rush to my cheeks, but also this incredible sense of belonging. That moment, in the middle of laughter and chatter, made it clear, whatever this was between us, it wasn't a secret anymore. Now, every time I think about how this all started, I'm amazed. What began as a simple plan to learn Spanish turned into something messy, beautiful, and real. Marco taught me that sometimes the most important conversations don't happen in words, they happen in the space between them. And I'm still learning how to listen. After that night with his friends, things between Marco and me started to feel more official, I guess. Like we both knew we weren't just two guys awkwardly swapping language tips anymore. But, funny enough, it wasn't like we suddenly started calling each other boyfriend or anything like that. No grand gestures or proclamations. Just this quiet understanding that whatever was happening was real. One afternoon, maybe 2 weeks later, we met up at that same cafe where it all began. I walked in before him, grabbed a table by the window, and nervously checked my phone. Marco was running late, something about a last-minute work call. I didn't mind, though. I was just excited to see him. When he finally arrived, he looked even better than I remembered. The way his shirt clung to his arms, the light in his eyes, it hit me like a punch. I'm not great with that kind of thing, you know? I usually keep my cool, but with Marco, I was a mess. He smiled when he saw me, that little one that always made my stomach do weird flips. He slid into the seat opposite me and started our usual spiel. ¿Qué tal tu día? How was your day? But this time, his voice had a softness I hadn't noticed before, like he was trying to say more than just the words. I took a breath and decided to be honest. Honestly, I think about you way more than I should. There, I said it. It felt like throwing all my cards down on the table. To my surprise, he didn't look shocked or pull away. Instead, he smiled wider, and the way his eyes crinkled made me feel like I'd just scored a goal in some invisible game only we played. Yo, también, he said quietly. Me pasa igual. I feel the same. We talked for hours that day, saying things we'd never said before. Not just in Spanish or English, but the kind of words that stick around. We shared stories about our past heartbreaks, dreams we'd tucked away, and the kind of fears you only admit when you're comfortable. It was messy and imperfect, but it was ours. One thing led to another, and before I knew it, Marco reached across the table, brushing a strand of hair from my forehead. His touch was electric, soft but deliberate. Sometimes, words fail us, he said, but our bodies, they don't lie. That stuck with me, because I realized he was right. We'd spent so much time trying to get the language right, but it was the little gestures, the shared silences, the way his hand found mine when the conversation got too heavy. That's what spoke the loudest. A few days later, I found myself at his apartment again. This time, the air between us was charged, but we didn't rush anything. We cooked dinner together, mostly me fumbling with Spanish recipes and Marco laughing at my attempts. When the food was finally on the table, we paused, looking at each other like we were both waiting for permission to cross some invisible line. I took a sip of wine and said, "Can I ask you something?" He nodded, eyes curious. "Why didn't you say anything before? About us?" Marco leaned back, a little embarrassed. I was scared. Scared that if I said it, it would change everything. And maybe it would have ruined what we had. I understood that. I had felt the same fear. But I also knew that if we kept pretending, we'd never get anywhere. So what changed? He smiled softly. You did. You made me realize that some things are worth the risk. That night, we finally let all the words and touches come together. No more hiding or pretending. It was slow and tender, filled with laughs and nervous glances. But it was real. Since then, our language exchange has become something much bigger. We still laugh about my terrible Spanish and his English mistakes, but now it's wrapped up in something that feels permanent. Every time I look at Marco, I see the person who taught me that love isn't always about perfect sentences or flawless grammar. Sometimes it's about the courage to listen to what your heart and your body are trying to say. And honestly, I can't wait to see where this story takes us next. After that night, things between Marco and me settled into this strange, wonderful rhythm. It wasn't all butterflies and perfect moments. Far from it, actually. But there was a kind of comfort in knowing we were both trying, even when the words got tangled or the silence stretched a little too long. One Saturday, he invited me over early afternoon to check out a vinyl shop nearby. I was still new to Berlin's music scene, and Marco was this walking encyclopedia of all things cool and Spanish and vintage. We met up outside this tiny, slightly dusty record store tucked between a bakery and a bookstore. The kind of place that smelled like old paper and coffee grounds mixed with nostalgia. He grinned when he saw me. Ready to find some treasures? I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I was more excited about the records or just spending time with them. Inside, the shop was cozy, walls lined with crates of vinyls and posters of faded rock bands. Marco immediately dove into a crate labeled Latin Classics, pulling out an old Santana album and holding it up like it was a rare gem. "This one's a masterpiece," he said, his fingers tracing the cover. "Ever listen to Abraxas?" I shook my head, leaning in closer not just to see the record, but to catch the way his eyes lit up when he talked about music. We spent the next hour flipping through stacks, swapping stories about songs we loved growing up. I told him about the indie bands I obsessed over, and he shared memories of his dad playing flamenco guitar on lazy Sunday afternoons back in Madrid. There was something about these little details, so personal, so real, that made me feel like I was finally peeling back the layers of Marco, beyond the surface of language lessons and coffee dates. When we finally left the shop, the sun was dipping low, casting warm golden light over the streets. We didn't have plans, so we just wandered, talking about everything and nothing. At one point, we stopped by a small park bench, and Marco pulled me close, resting his head lightly on my shoulder. "It's funny," he said, "how we started as strangers exchanging words, and now here we are." I smiled, feeling that same pulse of warmth in my chest. "Yeah, I never thought a language exchange could lead to this," he chuckled softly. "Neither did I, but I'm glad it did." That evening, back at his place, the atmosphere was quieter, more intimate. We cooked dinner together again. This time, a Spanish tortilla that Marco promised would be easy even for you. I was skeptical but willing to try. As we chopped potatoes and onions, our hands brushed more than once, lingering just a moment too long to be accidental. After dinner, we settled on the couch, wine glasses in hand, the soft hum of a flamenco guitar playing from the speakers. Marco looked at me, and for a moment, he didn't say anything. Then he reached out, tracing the line of my jaw with his thumb. "I want to know everything about you," he murmured. I swallowed, suddenly aware of how wide open I felt. "I want that too." We talked late into the night, swapping stories about childhood dreams, fears, and everything in between. I confessed how hard it was for me to open up sometimes, how I'd spent years hiding behind jokes and casual conversations. Marco listened, really listened, with a patience that made me feel safe. Slowly, the distance between us melted away, replaced by this electric closeness. When he finally leaned in and kissed me, it was soft but full of promise, like an unspoken agreement that we were in this together. Over the next few weeks, our relationship deepened in ways I hadn't expected. We kept up the language exchange, of course, but the lessons took a back seat to the moments that mattered most. The stolen glances, the shared meals, the quiet evenings where words weren't necessary. One night, we were lying in bed, the city lights casting shadows through the window. I confessed something that had been weighing on me. "I'm scared," I said. Not of us, but of what comes next, of telling people, of what they might think. Marco squeezed my hand. "I get that. It's not easy. But whatever happens, we have this. And that's what counts." His words gave me strength I didn't know I needed. We made a plan to take things slow, to be honest with ourselves and each other, no matter what. The next day, as we walked hand in hand through the bustling streets, I realized something important. Love isn't about grand declarations or perfect timing. Sometimes it's about two imperfect people finding their way together, learning each other's language bit by bit, spoken or unspoken. And with Marco, every word, every touch, every glance was a lesson I never wanted to stop learning. After deciding to take things slow and keep our relationship mostly to ourselves, I thought maybe the hardest part was over. Turns out, I was wrong. One chilly Sunday afternoon, Marco and I were curled up in his small living room, the kind of lazy day where you don't want to move but still want to be near each other. Berlin was wrapped up in its usual gray, and rain tapped lightly against the window. We'd been watching some old Spanish films. Marco insisted it was practice for my listening skills, but honestly, I think he just liked seeing me squint at the subtitles. Halfway through the movie, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a text from my roommate Felix, asking if I wanted to grab drinks later. I hesitated before replying. I didn't want to leave Marco alone, but I also felt a tiny tug of wanting to maybe get closer to my own social circle again, since meeting Marco had kind of pulled me out of my usual routines. "Are you coming tonight?" Felix's follow-up message popped up. I looked over at Marco, who was watching me with that soft, curious expression. "Want me to stay?" I asked. He shrugged, but I could tell that shrug was loaded. "Only if you want." That tiny invitation was enough to send my nerves into overdrive. I wasn't sure how to explain Marco to my friends yet, or even if I was ready for that. We'd talked about it a little, but the whole idea of coming out again, in a way, felt exhausting. "I'll go," I finally said, "just for a little while." Marco nodded, giving me a quick kiss on the cheek. "Have fun, and don't worry, I left his apartment feeling this odd mixture of excitement and anxiety. At the bar, the usual crowd was there. Felix with his usual loud laugh, some coworkers, and a few new faces I didn't know. Everyone was in good spirits, and after a couple of drinks, I started to relax. But then, Felix pulled me aside. "Hey, so when are you going to tell us about Marco?" His tone was casual, but expectant. I shrugged, trying to keep it light. "We're taking it slow. It's complicated." Felix raised an eyebrow. "Complicated how? I mean, you guys have been hanging out a lot, and you look happy." I smiled, but didn't answer. The truth was, I wasn't ready to open that door yet. Partly because I was still figuring it out myself, but also because I didn't want to risk losing the way things were with Marco. The night went on, and I caught myself glancing at my phone, hoping for a text or call to check in with him. When I finally did message, Marco replied almost instantly, just a simple heart emoji. It was enough to remind me that whatever was happening between us, it was real. Back at his apartment later that night, the rain was still falling, heavier now. Marco was waiting by the door, wrapped in a cozy sweater, looking like he'd been thinking about me all evening. "Did you have fun?" he asked, stepping inside. "A little," I admitted. "But I missed you," he smiled, pulling me close. I missed you too. That night, lying together in the quiet darkness, I found myself opening up more than before. I told him how scared I was of what people might think, how sometimes I felt like I was caught between worlds, my old life and this new one with him. Marco listened without judgment. Then he whispered, "We'll face it together. No rush. One step at a time." His calm confidence was like an anchor, steadying me when I felt adrift. I realized that maybe love wasn't about having all the answers. Maybe it was about finding someone who could hold your hand even when things were messy. A few days later, Marco surprised me by suggesting we take a trip. "Let's go somewhere," he said. "Just us, to practice your Spanish and to be free." I was hesitant at first, but the idea of escaping the city's gray routine was tempting. We booked a weekend getaway to a small town near the Spanish border, a place where the language would wrap around me like a warm blanket instead of a puzzle. Driving through winding roads, the countryside opening up in front of us, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known was possible. Marco pointed out vineyards, small villages, and the way the light hit the hills. That night, under a sky full of stars, we sat around a fire pit, wrapped in blankets. The only sounds were the crackling wood and our quiet voices. "I'm glad we're doing this," I said, reaching for his hand. Marco squeezed it gently. "Me too." We talked about our dreams. His to open a little café someday, mine to write stories that mattered. In that moment, language didn't matter. It was just us, two people learning how to speak the same heart. When we finally kissed, it was slow and sweet, like the culmination of everything unsaid. No words needed, just connection. That trip changed something between us. It was like the world outside faded away, and all that mattered was the space we created together. I realized that love, much like learning a new language, takes time, patience, and a willingness to stumble and try again. Back in Berlin, the city felt different, less intimidating, more like a place where I belonged. And with Marco by my side, I was ready to keep learning, keep growing, and maybe, just maybe, start telling the story out loud. The weekend trip felt like a turning point, but real life doesn't pause for magic moments. When we got back to Berlin, the city's usual noise and rush swallowed us up again, and suddenly, all those little fears and doubts came rushing back. I suppose that was inevitable, because as much as I wanted to live in the bubble of us, the outside world hadn't quite caught up yet. A few days after we got home, I was sitting in Marco's kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee and scrolling through my phone when he looked at me, this quiet expression on his face. It wasn't anything dramatic, but it made me feel like he was about to say something important. "You've been quiet lately," he said softly. "What's on your mind?" I hesitated. It wasn't the easiest thing to put into words. "I'm just worried, I guess, about us, about how to handle everything outside this apartment." Marco set his cup down and leaned back against the counter. "You mean telling your friends? Your family?" "Yeah," I shrugged, feeling suddenly self-conscious. I don't want to mess things up or make it weird. He smiled, this reassuring kind of smile that's more like a promise. We'll figure it out. Together. No pressure. But the truth was, I wasn't sure if I had that kind of confidence yet. I wanted to be open with people, to share this part of my life, but the vulnerability of it all was terrifying. That night, lying next to him, I found myself twisting the question over in my mind. How do you tell the people you've known forever that the person who matters most now is someone new, someone they don't know? The next morning, Marco surprised me with a plan. Let's start small, he said. We'll tell one person at a time, someone you trust. I nodded, feeling a little braver with him by my side. So the very next day, we met up with Felix. I'd kept Marco in the background for a while, but I realized it was time to bring him into my world a bit more. Felix was sitting at our usual cafe spot when we arrived. I felt my heart race as I introduced him. Felix, this is Marco. Felix grinned, giving Marco a quick handshake. Finally, the mysterious language tutor. Marco laughed, warm and genuine, and the three of us settled into easy conversation. Felix asked questions. Marco answered with his charming accent, and I could tell that the barrier was breaking down. Afterward, Felix pulled me aside. He's great, man. You should be proud. That moment felt like a small victory, but it also made me realize how much more there was to come. Over the next few weeks, Marco and I made an effort to be more open. We went out more together, walked hand in hand through the parks, shared meals at small restaurants where the waiters smiled knowingly when they saw us. Each step outside our little bubble felt like learning a new word in a complicated language called being brave. One evening, we were at a gallery opening for a friend's photography exhibit. The room was crowded and humming with conversation, the kind of scene where it's easy to get lost. Marco was chatting with some artists when I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned to see Jens, a coworker I'd been friendly with but never really close to. Hey, I didn't know you were bringing someone, he said, nodding toward Marco. I swallowed hard. This was the moment where I needed to be honest, not just for myself, but for us. This is Marco, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He's important to me. Jen smiled, and to my surprise said, good for you. It's about time. That simple acceptance felt like a weight lifting off my chest. When I looked back at Marco, he caught my eye and gave me a wink, and suddenly, the gallery felt less intimidating and more like home. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were days when the world felt heavy, when awkward questions or sideways glances reminded me that not everyone was as open or kind. On those days, Marco was my rock. I remember one particularly rough afternoon when I came home frustrated after a terse conversation with a family member who hadn't taken the news well. Marco just held me, no words, just steady warmth. Sometimes, that was all I needed. Our relationship wasn't perfect. Far from it. We had misunderstandings, moments of doubt, and days when the language between us felt tangled, even after all this time. But what made it real was that we kept trying. We learned each other's rhythms and hesitations, the subtle ways to say, I'm here, without needing to say a thing. One late night, as we lay tangled together, I whispered, thank you for being patient with me. He smiled, fingers tracing lazy circles on my arm. Gracias a ti for trusting me. It struck me then how far we'd come, from strangers with a shared goal of language practice to two people building a life in between words and silences. I don't know what the future holds, but with Marco, I'm learning that love is the most complicated language of all, one that's worth stumbling through, one imperfect syllable at a time. It's funny how life moves in these unexpected rhythms. After all the awkward beginnings, the quiet confessions, and the hesitant steps outside our comfort zones, Marco and I found something steady between the chaos. Not perfection. No, far from it, but a genuine connection that didn't need to be shouted from rooftops to feel real. A few months after that gallery night, we celebrated our 6-month mark with a simple walk along the Spree. The city was dressed in early spring colors, the air fresh and soft. We stopped by a little park bench, the same one where we'd shared our first real conversation about us. This time, there were no words needed. Marco just took my hand in his, fingers fitting perfectly like they were made for each other. I've been thinking, he said quietly, about how much we've grown. How far you've come. I smiled, feeling a swell of something warm in my chest. I couldn't have done it without you." He squeezed my hand gently. "We're learning together. That's what matters." In that moment, I realized that love isn't about grand declarations or perfect timing. It's about presence, in showing up for each other through the confusing, messy parts. It's about the quiet courage it takes to be seen and to see someone else fully, without hiding. When I look back, I'm grateful for every awkward text, every fumbling sentence, every touch that said more than words ever could. Because those moments built this, something real, something worth holding on to. With Marco, I've learned that communication isn't just about the language you speak. It's about listening with your heart, being patient with the silences, and daring to reach out even when you're unsure. As we walked on, hand in hand, the city lights flickering around us, I knew this was only the beginning. Not because everything was certain or easy, but because we were ready to face whatever came next, together. And honestly, that felt more beautiful than any perfect phrase I could ever say.